Hi, I'm Brenton O'Malley with my co-manager host, Rusty Tanton. This is The One-on-One, a podcast for software engineers.
Yeah, we're here with James Williams, who I have known for a long time. I've known him since, going back to 2007, back when we both had political blogs in the Georgia political blogging scene, as it was. Welcome, James. We're eager to talk to you today.
Well, yeah, good morning to everyone. And it has been a long time, Rusty. Rusty and I had lunch just a couple of weeks ago, and things tend to go in different directions at a certain point in a friendship, and it was really nice to reconnect again and just catch up on old times because we really were kind of in the wild west of the early time of social media, and some of the things we saw, it was incredible.
Yeah. No, it was a great time, and I think one of the things we talked about too is we both sort of missed that community aspect of it, just the connections with people, and that's definitely something we're hoping to, rekindle with this podcast, but maybe in a different direction, not in the political direction.
Yeah, definitely not in the politics. And I have great hopes for what you're doing here because that is something I missed. And Rusty, the mutual friends that we made and the sort of that crew of at the Atlanta sort of social media scene was fairly tight. And I'm at least in a parasocial relationship with most of them. In fact, I just saw one of our mutual friends is expecting, so
Oh,
that was
nice.
interesting to see that.
Cool. And you've been on the job market for going on about a year now. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So I was part of a reduction in force last year, a fairly large one, at a company that will remain nameless, tech sector here in Atlanta. And It has been an interesting journey because, first of all, we had had a series of layoffs, and I imagine there's a lot of people who have experienced that now. And so, of course, when that happens, the people, your colleagues, your friends, you sort of get signals from them of what's going on. And the signal that I was hearing from everyone was about 6 months, which at the time, the human reaction is, well, that won't happen to me. Uh, and and so I went to it fully thinking, you read the headlines, hottest job market we've had in 25 years or whatever, and I'm like, I've done this. I know I have this great value to my company. This is going to be a breeze. And that was pretty much carried me for that 6 month period that I heard about. And then I got past 6 months and I started going, well, this is a little different. Well, first of all, the thing I noticed was for a hot job market, there certainly seems to be a lot of people that are applying for the positions that I'm applying for. And the interviews I'm going on are multiple rounds, so there's obviously quite a lot of people going through this interview process. And what I quickly realized, which is easy now in hindsight, is that, the market was hot in certain sectors, but not ours. And, it almost viewing backwards now over the past year, I would almost say that at some point somebody's going to start talking about shadow recession in technology over the past year. And I've heard some people, some anecdotal things. Someone told me that a friend of theirs who's in the VC business basically said people don't realize it, but this is the worst market since 2009, maybe even going back to 1999 in the tech sector. And I've had a lot of time to think about a lot of that stuff and stuff that's not maybe that interesting to your listeners, but it is interesting that the last two jobs that I had, I thought about this a lot over the years, how odd it was. And it was that both times I got hired during a recession. The first one was was the first tech bubble. I mean, I literally got hired by a technology company as the entire market was crashing. And then the second time was in 2009 in the financial bubble. And this time, again, come out and see everyone's talking about, oh man, employers are having a hard time. You can do what you want, you can make all these demands, and we're in a boom economy, and I can't find a job. So it was a little bit of sort of the upside down world for me during that period, and still ongoing. So it's been an interesting challenge, and as I face things in life, Rusty knows this from back in the day when we were both doing a lot of writing. I like to understand and explore what I'm going through. So I've been trying to hang on to that from a positive aspect, but I won't say that it hadn't been a rocky journey.
Yeah, no doubt. Um, I guess going back to a year ago, right from when you first learned through now, how has your job search evolved over that time?
That's such a great question, and I think there's a lesson here for anyone who goes through it, whether you are some kind of a veteran like myself, or even someone who is just starting out their career. Is that you basically go through phases, and the first phase is I'm going to get exactly the job that I want, the job that I'm doing, and in fact, I had a fairly generous severance package. And I told a colleague of mine who also was laid off around the same time, I'm like, I'm going to go find the job I always wanted. I've been doing a job for a certain purpose for the past 14 years. Now I'm going to go do what I want. And, that lasts for about 3 months. And then you're like, okay, the next 3 months is, well, I used to do this thing a few years ago, project management in my case. There's got to be a lot of project manager jobs. And then you go through that. And then your next phase is you reach a pivot point where you have to sort of make a decision of, um, am I going to try to reconfigure this whole thing? Am I going to go back to school? Am I going to learn another skill? I went out and got a new certification, still sort of in my adjacent to my domain, but still I went and got new certification. So the longer you go, the important thing is that you have to continuously start to reconfigure your expectations, and
Mm,
managing the expectations is probably the hardest thing, because you're going to come to a point where you have doubts as to whether you fit in anywhere. And that can be really tricky. And when that comes along, to anyone who has to go more than a few months in this, the best thing I can say is you got to reach out to your friends. And I talk about him all the time. Even I'll talk about him in interviews sometimes. Uh, I've had one director who I've stayed close friends with over the year. Work in a lot of ways is like summer camp. Everybody thinks they're friends, and then when somebody moves on, you're like, we were always right, and then you never do. But I have one director that I still consider a good friend, and there was one point where I just called him and I said, I just need to talk to somebody.
Yeah.
And he gave me a little bit of a pep talk. And the job search can be a very isolating experience, and you're used to that rhythm of
mm,
all day where you got the brain working, you're in meetings, you're in design sessions, and your brain gets used to that, and then suddenly you're sitting there staring at LinkedIn for 6 hours a day. And so, at some point, if you get into a long term situation, you've got to find some ways to sort of not only recalibrate your expectations and what you're doing, but also recalibrate your brain and make sure that it's still operating like you were when you were surrounded by colleagues that you love to work with and were spitting ideas at you and doing all that. So I think that's been the sort of how the journey has played out for me.
One thing we were talking about at lunch the other day is so for managers specifically, because you were a manager,
Mhm.
and how it seems, and our previous guest Billy has talked about how he's actually had to pick up some hard skills again to get back into this market. Have you found yourself sort of tempted to pick up hard skills, or have you sort of stayed more in trying to hold firm and stay in a more purely management track in the jobs you've been looking for?
Not at all. And I think this is going to be what I think would be my best piece of advice. And this is not just for managers, but
Mm,
also for, well, it's primarily for managers, but it could be for engineers as well. And Rusty, you've been in management. I think this is going to hit home for you as well. Um, you've got to make a choice in your career, particularly once you get into management. I think the hardest thing I've had to deal with is I'm a little bit in what I call the squeeze. Nobody hires a middle manager from outside. It just
yeah.
doesn't happen. So once you get into management, you've got to decide on one of two things, I think. One is you've got to push higher, because once you get to a certain level, say director level or above, then you're going to build a network that if you have to change positions, is going to be unbelievably powerful for you. Or
mm,
you have to maintain hard skills. And I think this is particularly important for engineers. And listening to your conversation with Billy, is that if you do not maintain those skills, uh, they are going to rot just like code does. And you're going to be in a position like I'm in now where you're looking for engineering management jobs, and you're suddenly going to be taking tests, because they're not going to expect you to just be a person who knows how to lead a team. They're going to be a person who expects you to step in. Or you may even go so long that you're like not applying for management jobs anymore. You're applying for straight up engineer jobs. And if you haven't kept the skill set, and
Mm.
you guys know in your industry that, the dynamics and the methodologies change all the time, new languages, everything. So yeah, well, first, a lot of my skills sort of grew organically, project management related skills, and I didn't need to have a certification when I was in my last job. People just knew, you go to James and he gets something done. So yeah, I mean, I've gone and I've got my, my PSM, my professional scrum master certification, and I'm picking those up. And I swear, Rusty, you're going to laugh at this, but the other day I was like, you know what? I've always wanted to learn Python. Why not just learn Python? But I think the important thing is, particularly if you're in that sort of manager class, and particularly in the middle, which gets cut quite frequently in riffs, you got to make that decision. Am I ambitious that I want to be a director someday, so that you can get to that level where you can use that network for your leverage? Or if the worst thing happens, do I really love what I was doing before? Being project manager, making sure my PMP is up to date, being an engineer, making sure that I know the latest language or methodology, or whatever we're doing. The thing that you don't want to do is get caught in the middle, because at some point the decision's going to be made for you. Either you're going to have to go for moonshots to get jobs that you may not be qualified for, or you're going to be back down at the level where there's 1,000 other people doing it, and they've been doing it yesterday and you haven't done it in 6 years.
Right. Right.
Mm.
I certainly experienced that in my job, and I'm fortunate that mine only went about 4.5 months.
Yeah.
That's relatively short right now. But I went and picked up hard skills. Like, I mean, I went and I was learning Next.js, and I was learning Prisma ORM and stuff like that, because I certainly was starting to eye a lot of those IC jobs as we started getting into month 4, 5, and 6, because I thought I was going to have to go take one of those.
Yeah, so I actually have a follow-up question to before your follow-up question, Rusty. Um, so you have this director friend, and basically he's part of your network. So you reached out just to talk and just to kind of almost get mentorship.
Yeah.
Um, what's been your experience just trying to find new mentorship or networking while you're not currently on the job?
It's incredibly hard, and I feel like this is going to be, James gives his unemployment talk, because I'm going to continue to give advice, because I don't want people to have to go through some of the things that I've gone through.
Mhm.
The most important thing you can do while you're on the job is not just have colleagues. You need to make friends. And that was, I will admit, difficult for me to do, because I'm Gen X, so making friends is not natural to
Mm.
us in general, and I don't want to get too cliche about the Gen X, but we also were coming just from that one
Mm.
generation where the whistle went at the end of the day, and you went home to your family, and work was work and
Mhm.
family was family, and everything was very segmented.
Mm.
You got to make friends. Your colleagues will go so far for you, but friends have skin in the game for you. And that is where it has been valuable. And their thing is it's been a little bit a little bit Ebenezer Scrooge, even though that's not the personality I was as a leader. But I've had to lay people off. That's just something that comes with the business. And I
Mm.
think back to that, and I'm like, I think I did everything I could for that guy, but did I really? But the network that has worked for me are the colleagues who are also, I think, pretty close friends, because again, they've got
Mm.
some interest in me as a friend and not just as a colleague. So that's the biggest thing, because once you get into the situation, expanding your network can be extremely challenging, because quite frankly, everything becomes very transactional. It's numbers. It's you read up on what you're supposed to do on LinkedIn, and it's like you need at least 300 contacts, and it's like, oh God, how do I build 300 contacts? I have 50.
Mhm.
And then you're making contacts with people who are like, they have no interest in me. I don't have a lot of interest in them, maybe, but I've got to do this. And so it becomes more of a game, and it's gamified at that point. And that
Mm.
can be one of the hardest things about this, is because it's like, what am I doing? I had a purpose a year ago. I was leading people. I was mentoring the next generation of IT leaders. And now I'm trying to gamify LinkedIn. That can be
Yeah.
very difficult. So what you have to do, people use the term network, and I think they use it too generically, and it's almost become a word that just sort of floats by and you don't even think about
Hmm.
it. While you're still on the job, you have to establish your network then, and that network has to be deeper than you think it is.
Yeah. More of a connection,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. I think I hear a lot of terms like there's a lot of generational trauma within management and how we were raised to believe our bosses were to us.
Yeah.
And there was always this you keep a chasm between yourself and your employee. And I really think that that's that mindset that needs to change now. Managers need to be supporting those and building that connection. And it's not all about I am over you. I get to, you're reporting to me, so I have a
Yeah.
bunch of control over you. That's like a lot of the mentality that I feel like needs to change.
Yeah, it's actually, I think it's unfortunate that some of that still is a hangover from the
Hmm.
way work used to be. I certainly never believed that. I'll go back in time a little bit here. And my first leadership position, this was actually before I was in technology. I was working for the
Hmm.
state, and I had no idea how to lead people. I was 28 years old. I mean, I thought I did because I was 28 years old.
Right.
uh, but I walked into a room of people who had been at this agency for many years, uh, beyond what I had been there. Most of them were
Mm,
at least 10 years older. Half of them had applied for the job that I had just been plopped in from the outside, and probably most of them
mhm,
looked at it as I had been done a favor by somebody, which is the way it worked back then.
mm, mm.
And so I had sink or swim really fast. And I think that most of my management techniques developed in that first year of dealing with that situation. And, Rusty knows this, but I use a lot of metaphors. That
Mm,
managers, in my experience, there are basically two types. And I've seen both work, and I've worked for both. There's if you're a person who rides horses, first time you get on a strange horse, you do one of two things. You either jerk the reins hard to let them know who's boss, or you lay the reins down on the neck to see what their attitude is.
mm,
I was the second type. I always was. The first job I had, it was purely survival. I mean, half these people hated me because I'd taken a job they
mhm.
had. Um, and I think overall the industry is changing. I think the culture
Yeah,
is changing to go more to that with things like, Scrum methodology, which has been around forever now, where you have people who it's not someone dictating this is what you do and this is what you do and this is what you do. I think that is changing. I think there's still a lot of room to grow. I still, and particularly, I'll say this, even though some of these people may be interviewing me in the next month or so. I think it's much more apparent at the executive level,
yeah,
and sometimes understandably so. Particularly if you work for a public company, the pressures there are enormous.
mm,
If you've ever seen a C-suite schedule,
yeah.
it's the
It's
stuff of
fair.
nightmares.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you this. Here's how I'll wrap it up. And I know I'm talking and talking here,
It's okay.
but it's so good to just be able to talk about this stuff.
Yeah,
Is that the thing is it doesn't matter if you're managing engineers. It doesn't matter if you're managing construction crew. It doesn't matter if you're the manager of the CarMax. People are people, and you have to manage the people. And there's nothing you're going to find in a book that will teach you how to do that. There is no sort of magic formula. It is not an equation. The good leaders, whether they're the jerk the reins or the lay down on the neck of the horse type, are the good managers are the ones that find how to have a relationship with those people that they are leading. And because the only way that you're going to find out strengths and
mm,
weaknesses, which is critical to your job, is you have to
yeah,
understand that human being, and you have to have some empathy for them. And a lot of my people that work for me, they worked for years. And this was in a time where job hopping wasn't just a thing, it was almost a requirement. Like, how do you,
yeah.
nobody stays in a job 2 or 3 years. They did. And I feel that at least a small part of that was the fact that I took the time to understand them, understand where they were going in life, understand all that. But at the same time, in the back of my head, as the leader, I'm like, well, also, this is how I can leverage this. And I
Hmm.
think employees need to understand that as well. The manager is not your friend. They can be your friend, but at the end of the day, a boat has one person that's at the pointy end at the wheel, and everything that they are doing is to can be to better you, but ultimately to better themselves and the company. So I think it's important to have that strong connections like you're talking about, Breslin, but I think it's also very
Mhm.
important to be realistic about this is a job, this is a company, particularly if you're at a public company, and everyone has their purpose. And to understand that purpose, don't necessarily always have to agree with, but if you come to an
Mhm.
understanding, then you can make it an environment where everybody succeeds.
So I tell my kids I'm your parent first and your friend second.
Yeah.
And, you know, I kind of hate to relate management to parenting because it you end up talking about grown ass adults like they're little kids,
Oh, I have.
um, but I end up doing it anyway. And so I've actually I've told people who have reported to me the same thing, like I'm your manager first and your friend second. And
Yeah.
ultimately, it part of my job is to tell you things you don't want to hear sometimes, and to tell you things that are hard to hear sometimes. And I'm not doing you any services if I'm not telling you those things.
And sometimes I'll add on to that quickly. Sometimes
Yeah,
to know things that it wouldn't benefit you to know.
yeah.
You know? So
I
that's all
struggle
part
with
of it.
that, withholding
Yeah.
information. I'm not good at it.
Well, I tell you how I deal with that because I think it's an important one, and this I think relates a little bit to some of my struggles, honestly, with job seeking. Is I have an almost allergic reaction to deceit,
Yeah,
Mm.
and I think if you can, first of all, if you can establish that relationship with the person on your team of uh, I'm going to understand you, you're going to understand me. It makes it much easier for them to understand that at some point there are going to be things that I do that you're not going to understand. And this was something that I had to learn the hard way with a lot of C-suite executives. Something that is very important to me. I'm looking at one tree. They're looking at 10 forests across the continent. But as long as you keep honesty as part of the equation, the this is not just in business. This is in relationships. This is in your
Yeah.
personal life. The minute that you cross that chasm of dishonesty, you've lost forever. You never recover that,
Mm.
yeah.
or it's extremely hard to. So I think that's how you deal with the fact that, first of all, you got to establish that base knowledge of we understand each other, and there's going to be certain parts of this relationship that are going to act this way. And sometimes that's going to include me telling you to do something you don't want to do. Sometimes it's going to be me telling you to do something you want to do, and I'm not going to explain it. But as long as you're fundamentally honest with that person and they believe that you understand what is going
Hmm.
on, I think you're going to be successful.
One follow up to that is, could you actually explain a situation where you cannot give information, but you have a very intelligent person, because they're an
Mhm.
engineer, who needs to know the why behind the ask? Because it's very common.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm going to go back in time here a little bit to the last few years of my career. I've been mostly managing network engineer types, which
Mhm.
very different from software developers. I mean, they're I'm not putting them down in any way, but in a sense, they're sort of mechanics, whereas
Mm.
software developers are like R&D and things like that. But many years ago, when I was managing more of an R&D type team, and we were working on something, and I had a guy, he actually went to my high school, and we became very good friends, and we're still very good friends. But he was a why guy, and we were working with a very big customer, and his biggest thing was not why are we doing this? I don't understand it. His was why are we doing this? This is stupid. Uh,
Yes. Yes. Yes,
because
exactly.
yeah, he felt it was, well, it was that was just his type. Actually, quick tangent story. It was a small team. It was only three engineers, and the two main guys. And this was tell you how long ago this was. This was back in the client server days. So I had a client guy and a
Mhm.
server guy, and talking about engineer archetypes. This guy was a steady 80 miles an hour on the
Mhm.
freeway the entire time, following you 3 inches. Just it was always questions, just everything was, but it was never very volatile. It was just always he's going to be in my desk 4 times a day asking,
Mhm.
Why are we doing this? This is stupid. The other guy was total grandpa going down the country road 35 until he lost it. And then he was 120.
Mm-hmm.
So first of all, going back to talking about management, one of the important things is you have to understand those personalities. But the way that I dealt with, I'm tempted to say his name because he may listen to this, but I'm not. The way I dealt with a guy who was, why are we doing this is stupid. Sometimes the answer was just like you're saying, Rusty. It was because that's the business.
Right.
you know, one of the things I've done over the years is I've mentored a lot of IT leaders, and I tell them all, um, you can disagree, you can question, uh, and I say usually you want to use the rule of three. Do it twice. The third time, if you get the same answer, stop asking the question. Because ultimately, like you said, Rusty, that's the person who's giving your performance review. That's a person who can decide to lay you off. These are big things, and we shouldn't be shy about talking about them. So with Richard, I knew that I had to have a discussion with him. I knew that he was an incredibly creative person. 90% of the time, I knew he was right. I also
Mm-hmm.
knew that a couple hours later, I had to go to a very large mobile provider's headquarters and meet with their project manager. And one of the answers I could not give her was, "This is stupid." So ultimately, I had to hear Richard out. I had to hear exactly, because really all he wanted to do is explain why he knew the world better than anybody else. And then at the end of the day, i- if he was right enough that I could take it to the customer and I could translate Richard's sort of I'm arrogant and know how to design a piece of software better than anyone in the world, which by the way is a trait you want to some degree in a software developer. If I could translate that into the customer, then I'd take it to him.
Mm-hmm.
If it wasn't, then I'm going to hear him out. And at the end of the day, I'm going to say, Richard, you're probably right. It is stupid. Sometimes the world works on stupid, and we're going to put this feature in and we're going to QA it and we're going to make sure it works as best as we can make it work. And that's going to be the end of it. And he was usually okay with that, just as long as he felt like that I understood his worldview of
Mm-hmm.
why this is not the thing we should be doing.
That's great advice.
Yeah. That line between confidence and ego, that's a really tough one, right?
Yeah.
I
Like,
had I had a mentor one time. I used to long time ago. I worked in the theater. I was actually a designer, and my mentor told me one time. She says you need to have an ego, and I'm not a very egotistical person. I probably was back then. If you ask my friends, I was not a very nice person back
that's
then.
what somebody with an ego would say, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And my
Mm-hmm.
mentor said, particularly in the theater business, which is one of the harshest business you can be in, said you need to have an ego because sometimes you don't have food, but you still got your ego. So so
Ooh.
so don't downplay the ego, and managing the egos on the team is one of the toughest things to do. But you have probably seen engineers that are like this that get burnt out, and part of that
Mm-hmm.
is they are no longer sure and they are no longer confident in what they're doing. And confidence and ego they're orthogonal, they're next to each other. So don't be afraid of ego, but as a manager you need to learn how to manage it.
Mm, that's very wise. I find with ego involved, and maybe it's just a lot of confidence, that type of archetype actually takes on more work than they realize and have a
Yes.
really hard time delegating.
Yep.
How have you managed through situations like that?
Well, I think I've totally seen that as well. And this guy, the example that we're using here, he was absolutely that guy. He would I'd give him a list of features, and he would just sit there and just gobble and gobble and gobble until he could fall
Hmm.
out of the chair. And he never wanted to be in management either, which is fine.
Right.
This is where you get back to fundamentals of leadership, and where this is going to sound harsher than I mean it, but ultimately, as a leader, what you're looking at is a toolbox, and not every tool in there works the same, and not every tool in there is for the same purpose. I'll give you another example. When I took over, my last job, basically, I took over a very embryonic implementation team, and they had 4 project coordinators, and they were all doing everything exactly the same. And I won't go into the details of the problem they had, but they had a problem of they were mixing the transactional with the long-term sort of project planning. And there was this one older guy on there, and he was miserable. Like, he had a health crisis in the first 3 months I was on the job.
Mm.
And I'm like, oh
Mm.
man, I mean, I'm in this brand new job. These guys don't know me, and suddenly I've got this old guy who's been here forever. It seems to be a repeating theme in my career. And he's in the hospital because he's so stressed out. And I found out that he hated the project planning, hated it, hated it, hated it. And he loved sitting there and doing almost mindless tasks just on repeat. Said, okay,
Yep.
well,
Yep.
I've got a problem here because I've got a whole bunch of mindless tasks that are basically plugging up my project management system. I'm going to bifurcate these two things. I'm going to take you, old veteran who will sit in front of a ticket queue for 8 hours a day, and you're going to take every
Hmm.
single one of these. And these young guys over here who are extremely hungry and want to prove themselves, I'm about to put them on some of the toughest projects they've ever been on. And it was just that recognition that not only did I have a different set of tools that I was dealing with, I had a problem that I had to fix too. And if you can
Hmm.
find some way to make, the issue you've got with your team and how it's constructed or the personalities or what, if somehow you can slot that into a problem you got to fix, I mean, that's every leader in any industry will take that win all day long.
I love that answer.
100%.
That's great.
So one other thing I want to bring up, James. This is an article we were kind of passing around before the podcast started. It's a BBC article that mentions an AARP survey that was done in 2022. Roughly 80% of workers between the ages of 40 and 65 have reported having either witnessed or personally faced age discrimination at work. And this percentage represents the highest recorded by the organization since it began conducting polls on the issue among older adults in 2003. Have you experienced any of this in your job hunt or on the job, especially in more recent years?
Well, first of all, let's get the hard part out of the way. That I'm Generation X, and being called an older
Mm.
worker is not quite as painful as getting
Yeah.
laid off, but it's pretty close. Uh, no, I've been fortunate that I've never experienced that, and I don't have any knowledge of this, but I hope that at least in our industry, there's less of that. I think there probably is, than in some of the older industries. I will say this though, in the job search, and again, I've not experienced this and I have no knowledge of it, but you can't help but think that I'm presenting a resume that shows a work experience going back to the year 2000.
Hmm.
And I know that there's a lot of other resumes that are going in there that show the work experience going back to, I don't know, 2015, 2016.
Mm.
And even though it's illegal, it's hard not to put that together. So I've not experienced it, but it's something that sort of sits in my mind quite a bit. And for workers, older workers, Gen X workers, who, by the way, and
Industry veterans.
not to get too cliche into the generational stuff, because I think a lot of that's overblown. But I do think the one thing that is true is we are the people that get stuff done. Uh, but yes, industry veterans. One of the things that you're probably facing and that you've got to find a way to maneuver around, and it's the thing I think about a lot, is people. It's more of a passive form of age discrimination than anything blatant, but they think that you're not going to be able to adapt. You're not going to be able to adapt to the culture. You're not going to be able
Hmm.
to adapt to the way we do things here. I in one of my leadership jobs, I told you about the first one where I walked in and I was the guy who was 28 and everybody was in their
Yeah.
40s and worrying about this kind of stuff. But I've also had the reverse. I've had, a director come to me and say, "You're going to be managed by this guy, and he's 20 years younger than you, or maybe it was 10. I'm not that old." Uh, and I was like, "Okay, that's not a problem." But for older workers, I think I think the fear is real. Uh, one of the A person who I knew once who was laid off and was a little older than I am now, and was very forthright with me about the terror of, I'm going to go out there and nobody's going to hire me. I think you got to confront that. And then I think you got to think about your strategies to get around it. You got to find ways to convince people that you are going to be a fit for their culture. You got to find ways to convince people that you understand how things work now. You
Mm,
know, that you're not going to be shocked if somebody, yeah, I got a friend, I won't say the company, but he's a director, and he is, the majority of his workforce is at least 10 years younger than him. And he told me one time, he said, I had an employee come up to me and say, my stomach's a little shaky today, so I may have to go to the bathroom a lot. And he's just like, you didn't have to tell me that. Uh, but my point is that you've got to be able to convince people that you're not going to be shocked that things are not going to work the way they did 20 years ago, because they don't.
mhm,
And I know that people that are my age, they are that way, but you forget that you've got to convince people that you're that way. And the biggest part of finding a new job is, and in my, at least from my experience, the hardest part, and the part that just wears you out, is you're pitching all the time. You're a salesperson, even if you weren't a salesperson, and the product is you.
mm,
And with older people, you've got to find a way to make people believe that this right here, this right here is not all there is to you.
Yeah. Yeah. So demonstrating ways, like I know one of the things I had to do, because I mean I'm a little younger than you, but I'm also I'm in that Gen X cutoff where I'm starting to encounter at least the potential for some of these things to happen. Um,
Yeah.
I've been at this 19 years. Like, you say that number out loud, and it sounds like a really long time. Um, one of the things I had to emphasize both in my resume and in interviews that I think did help some was that at every stop along the way, I've adapted to some new circumstances, and
mhm.
that I've shown and demonstrated over and over and over again I can adapt, I can change.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that can be a hard thing to quantify sometimes.
Yeah, it's really hard part, and particularly for people who are in leadership positions. You know, I know I can lead a team. I've done it for a long time, and in fact, in every interview that I have been on, I have talked more about the people who have gone on to success under my leadership than I've talked about my success as my own leadership.
Right.
That's still hard to quantify, and again, I've been on the other side of the desk of where I am now. And the other thing you got to remember is that being a hiring manager is one of the highest stakes things you can be in any company. Anytime you make that offer letter, you're making a bet. And you're making a bet that you have gained enough knowledge that this person is going to contribute to whatever the mission is that you are on.
Mhm.
And that can be a little bit terrifying. And when you're like me, where most of the skills are soft, or Rusty like you, who has a lot more hard skills, but your emphasis has been soft, one of the things you have to do as a job seeker is you've got to find a way to convince them that it's quantifiable. And the thing that you have to do is you have to figure out a way for them to see the value. And the softer your skills are, the more you're in leadership and management, the harder that is to do. And you just got to find a way to do it. So yeah, you combine those two things with, I realized earlier we're on a podcast, although we're doing video too, and I said this and that, and I was pointing to my gray hair and my gray beard. But you combine that with the age thing, and it can be very fraught. And all I can say to folks who are sort of in my boat, both from an age perspective or veteran perspective, and from a skills perspective, is work on your strategies. Figure out a way to make that hiring manager say, I'm making the right bet, because that's what their purpose in life is. And just like we were talking about with the leadership thing, unless both sides of a deal understand the purpose and think they're winning, it's never going to work.
Mm, yeah, absolutely. I hear from hiring managers, one of the things that they're evaluating is, can I work with this person? Like, will I enjoy spending 8 hours a day with this person?
Yeah, that's that's
And
that's almost always the first thing. And
right.
and particularly, I used to be in a position where I wasn't just hiring ICs, but I was hiring other leaders. And yeah, if you that in fact, a lot of times I was brought in as sort of the last interview, and anyone who's ever been on any interviews, much less as long as I have, knows that the last interview is the culture fit. And that's really about, can we work with this person?
Hmm.
And the margins when you're out there interviewing, particularly in your field where you're engineers, the margins, the chances that Breslin, that you're going to be against somebody who's going to have some sort of magic, engineering skill that no one has ever heard of to make the difference between you and that person, that's almost
Yeah.
nil. The difference is going to come down to that the skills and the things of that nature, that's table stakes.
Hmm.
Where you've got to make a difference, particularly in an interview, is, do I have a connection with this person? And that's
Yeah.
when you're going to get hired, because that goes back to them succeeding at their purpose, which is, does this person work for this mission?
Yeah. Right. And that just, I mean, it's actually very logical to look at building a team that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
One follow up to that too. I've heard culture fit mentioned a couple of times. You sort of started in a little bit on what you mean by that, which is, can I work with this person? Can we talk a little bit more about what's meant by culture fit? Because I hear that term thrown around a lot,
Yeah.
and how do we quantify that?
And I'm going to be, again, here's where I say something that I may regret in an interview 2 weeks from now. I'm not a big fan of the term. Now, part of this is probably that, I'm you guys are going to see this on the camera. The people listening won't, but I'm about to go into one of my characters that I play. I'm just a simple South Georgia farm boy, and the work is the work, and this and that. Culture is important. I don't want to downplay that. I think that it is used too frequently as a marketing term, particularly in how people approach the hiring.
Hmm.
Marketers like to say, I was looking at a job yesterday and my wife was over looking my shoulder and she's like, they have a ping pong table. I'm like, yeah, okay. Uh, I worked at a job where the culture was, we had Bagel Monday. And that's what culture sort of
Hmm.
becomes, particularly in the more corporate environments, is it becomes sort of these totems of, we're fun, this is
Yep.
the place you want to come to. Culture that matters is how people treat
Mm.
each other, how they interact with
Mm.
each other. What are the expectations of when I mess up?
Hmm.
I've been in cultures where it was a tattletale culture, and let me tell you about
Hmm.
how miserable that kind of culture can be. So hiring managers are looking, when they're talking about a culture fit, they're talking exactly what Breslin, you and I were talking about. Can I sit in a room with this person for 8 hours? That's really the only culture that matters. If you're a job seeker looking for a culture, you need to understand, I'd say the first thing you need to understand is, what is the business? What type of business is it? Is it a hardcore operations business where
Hmm.
you have 5 9 SLAs, and the expectation is if you mess that up, you may be fired? Because that's that culture. I don't care how many ping pong tables and bagels they have. So as
Right.
a job seeker, the first thing you've got to do is do your research and understand that what the culture really means is, how does that business operate? How do I fit into it? And what happens if things go sideways?
Mm. Yeah, I do. I really think that's important, especially if you're looking for a remote position. That entire idea of what culture is kind of goes by the wayside. And in the end, it's more of a diverse hire of sorts, where what kind of ideas will this person add that we haven't had on this team before?
Yeah, absolutely. And with remote positions, yeah, a lot of the sort of culture stuff kind of goes out the window. But if you think
Hmm.
about it, it's exactly what you just said, Breslin, which is just a very different culture. Um, Nobody wants to be on a Zoom call for 4 hours.
Yeah,
Can you get to the point? Are you bringing something to the table? Are you getting the juices flowing in the people who are on the other side of that camera? The remote culture, in many ways, we haven't quite figured it out yet. But I honestly
hmm,
believe, having done this for a very long time, is that culture is going to be more about, um, it's obviously not going to be ping pong tables. It's going to be about what goes on inside the brain space, you
right,
know, because all you're really bringing to it is your ideas and how you talk to people and how
right,
you relate to them, and how, you're seeing, it's a weird thing. There's a lot of debate right now about back to the office and everything, and the importance of people
right.
seeing each other face to face. And I think there's a lot to it. And when you're going for remote jobs, you have to understand that you're talking to people just like we're doing now,
Yep.
And that's
Yeah,
never going to be the same as just popping over somebody's
it
cube.
isn't.
And
Hmm.
you got to be comfortable with that culture, just like all the rest.
Yeah, I think something that's not talked about a lot with remote culture is what has to be there is trust on
Hmm.
both sides. You have
Yes.
to trust your leaders, and and those leaders have to trust you. And without that, I think that it crumbles really quickly.
Yeah, and that goes to the previous conversation we had about
Hmm.
culture. Long before COVID, a company that I worked for, we got acquired by another very larger company, and that company had a remote culture, and this was like back in the early to mid 2010s. Yeesh. I can't believe I had to figure that out. But they had a very remote culture. They encouraged it, and we were hardcore operations stuff. I'm talking about we were slinging big iron and server farms type stuff. In a remote, we were like, eh. My boss at the time, he literally made a checklist. These are the things you will agree to if you are going to be remote, and it included like things like, there won't be any children's noise and stuff like this. Now, this was almost 10 years ago, so a
Mm-hmm.
lot of things have changed since then, but it goes back to culture, and particularly with remote culture, you want to be careful about how that works. Are they going to be people who have adapted to the new world of remote? Are they
Yeah.
old school people that are like, I can't hear a lawnmower in the background? Remote culture, I think we're still figuring it out, but it's definitely something that you need to understand before you get into a job that where you're going to be remote.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, James, it has been fantastic to have you on the podcast. Do you have any parting thoughts you want to leave folks with before we sign off here?
The hardest thing is the hardest thing when you're writing a book is the first page and the last page. Um, I know there's a lot of people. I know that I'm not alone in long term. I actually just passed my anniversary of being laid off, and it was a distressing day, not necessarily for me, but the number of people that I saw on LinkedIn that I knew that's like, hey, I'm still out here, still looking.
Mm.
Um, the one thing that I take away from this, I'm extremely fortunate. Even though I've gone through a year of unemployment, I'm only two generations from people who went through the Depression. And that was to my benefit in preparing for some of the things that I've had to do in the
Mm.
past year, and why I can still say I'm fortunate. And I know there's other people who are struggling a lot harder. Um, it's going to happen, and it's like anything. There's a saying that we use around our house a lot: not at all, then all at once. And that is, you don't want to fall into cliche, but I can't count on both hands and taking my shoes off how many times that has happened. And if you're still out there and you're still struggling and you're like, I was just a few months ago, I don't know that I fit anywhere. It's going to happen. You just got to, like I said at the beginning, every now and then you're going to need to recalibrate, figure out the expectations, figure out your strategies, work that network as much as it's painful. And no one goes on forever not getting what they need to get. As the grandchild of people who sometimes were just eating corn because that's all it was, one day you get through it. I guess that's about all I can think about most days.
James,
Awesome.
thank you so much. It's been wonderful talking to you.
I really, really enjoyed it. And I love this. I love that it's a podcast. I think you guys are doing something that is great, not just because, some days we were coming on, I was thinking, well, the world really needs another podcast about software and engineers. But then I've known Rusty for a long time. I've known what it's going to be, and people need to hear other people, and they need an outlet for not just the work or the job or the culture or whatever. There's still a lot of facets of this industry we've not explored, and I think what you guys are doing are great.
Thank you,
Thank you so
James.
much. Opinions expressed on the one on one belong only to us and our guests, not to any of our respective employers. Speaking of that, does this platform call to you? Do you need a one on one? You can find us on the web at the oneonone.show. That's the number one on the number one dot show, where you can sign up to be a guest.
You can also find us in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, and YouTube by searching for The One-on-One. Please rate and review us on those services. It really helps us out. The One-on-One wouldn't be possible without listeners like you and a fantastic community of people who help us in large and small ways. Special thanks to Cameron Cooper, who helps us with marketing, Michael Ducharme, who created our bumper music, and Elena Sayaj, who's been a huge booster since day one. Thanks for listening.